"Hey Frank, you good?" I hadn't appreciated how different it would be under the water's surface. With so much trash overhead, the sun was barely visible, and my eyes struggled to adjust after the blinding light of the Pacific sun. It was nearly pitch black and the water was cloudy from all the sediment and microplastics. It reduced visibility to a few meters, and Adam and Hannah looked like little more than blurry shapes in the dark, even though they were no more than a few feet away. "Yeah, I'm okay." It was second nature to keep my mouth shut underwater, and I knew that it was going to be some time before I got used to talking in these new diving masks. Adam and Hannah nodded at each other, and both turned their lights on. To my relief, visibility improved enough that if I squinted, I could see who was who based on either a slim or muscular silhouette. Hannah gently glided over and tapped her helmet to remind me to turn my own light on. I fumbled for the switch and it lit up, revealing her blue eyes smiling at me as she floated a few feet away. I caught a glimpse of her smiling blue eyes and was reminded of why Discovery executives were scouting her as a potential TV presenter. Much better. She laughed as she checked that I was securely attached to the dive line. "You see, it's not so bad, is it?" "Is he good?" Adam asked her, and she gave the okay sign to let him know that I was. Still, Adam looked me up and down and asked directly, "Frank, you good, buddy?" I managed a gentle nod. "We need to be careful," Adam said as he floated over and took hold of where my suit clipped onto the dive line. "The masts will let us talk to each other in the ship while underwater, but it won't give the sound any sense of distance or direction, so it can be pretty disorienting. Now listen to me carefully. Do not unclip yourself from the dive line. If you break the surface, there'll be about a foot of trash at least, blocking your view for 360 degrees. You won't be able to see the ship, and you do not want to get lost out here." Only the last few words got through my mental fog. My heart was racing, and even under the wetsuit, I could feel shivers crawling across my skin. We floated in a cloud of suffocating plastic snow, lit only by the occasional slither of sun, as the sea parted the trash overhead. I could feel a confusing mix of claustrophobia and agoraphobia. We were trapped between the vast open void below and the ceiling of trash overhead. My movement was sluggish, and all around me the hazy abyss flickered with constant motion that I tried to track and make sense of. These were warm waters, I thought. There had to be life all around us, and surely it couldn't all be friendly. Jellyfish, sharks, parasites galore. The sea was filled with all sorts of nasty stuff, and it had to be out there somewhere, aware of us. As if it was summoned by my anxious thoughts, something strange caught my eye, floating far away at the very limits of my vision. A flicker of motion, shifting patterns of light that my brain correlated with or without sufficient evidence. By the time that I turned to look fully in its direction, it had already gone. The only sense that it left me with was one of great size. "Frank?" Adam poked me with a finger. "Dude, are you okay?" I turned to see the other two divers staring at me. "I'm good," I said. "Let's get this over with." It was with great relief that I found my hand touching the side of the ship once more. It had been an hour since we had left, and I had made sure to point and shoot at every little thing that Hannah told me to. Now it was over, and I couldn't wait to get out of that dang water. My anxiety had caused me to babble on endlessly about random crap, and more than once Hannah had basically told me to shut up. But after a few minutes, I would start up again, yammering on about any old thing just to keep my mind off my fear. It didn't help that I kept seeing something lingering at the very edge of my sight, circling at a distance while refusing to solidify into anything that I might recognize. Adam noticed that I was distracted, and he gave my arm a tap to get my attention. "Frank, you're last because the equipment is so heavy. That way I can help the others bring you up." "Oh crap, really?" I groaned. "You can take it off," he replied. "We'll take you up separately to the equipment." I clutched at my cameras protectively. They were how I made a living, and I wasn't letting them go easily. No, I'll be last, I said. Right, well, don't go wandering off, he said, and both he and Hannah laughed. I chuckled as well, but I grabbed the dive line and checked that I was still attached to the ship just in case. By the time that I looked back, Adam was already being lifted out of the water by 3 pairs of eager hands. Hannah stayed beside me until Adam gave us the okay, and just as quickly she reached her arms into the air and left the water. Holy crap, I heard Adam's voice in my ear. I swiveled expecting him to be right beside me, but he must have left his helmet on, and I could hear him talking to the others on deck. What the heck is that? Somebody cried in the background, but there was a clamor of voices and gasps that made my blood run cold. Helpless and paranoid that they were talking about something in the water, I turned sluggishly to catch sight of what might be behind me, but there was only a wall of trash 1 foot high. It's no way, not out this, here, doesn't belong. I pushed myself closer to the ship and reached up, but no one was there to grab me. I started to slap the hull, desperate to get their attention, but no one was coming. Whatever they had seen, I had fallen to the bottom of the priority list. When I screamed into my radio, I was only one of a dozen people shouting for attention. Even worse, I caught a snippet of what Adam was saying. Shark. Shark? I cried into my headset. Guys, did you just say a shark? I pushed my back to the ship and ducked underwater to see what might be nearby. There was only open water stretching off into a deep, dark blue beneath my feet. For a second there, I lost myself staring into those abyssal waters until a flicker of movement caught my attention and I scanned the water around me. That was when something strange emerged out of the murky distance. A torpedo-shaped monstrosity far larger than anything else I had expected. Whatever this thing was, it was the size of a school bus with fins as large as my chest. Frank, it's a whale shark, Hannah cried joyfully into my headset. Oh my god, that's incredible. They never come out this far. What the heck is a whale shark? I whispered, terrified of attracting this leviathan's attention. It's harmless, Hannah replied. Utterly harmless, I promise you, Frank, it won't hurt you. That's incredible. She was giggling. It's a filter feeder, Adam interjected. Curious but friendly. Frank, it won't hurt you. It might even play with you. Hannah was babbling on in the background. Whether she was right about the gentle giant or not, it didn't matter to me. The whale shark disappeared into the filthy water, and my skin crawled with the knowledge that it might still be circling close by. Having had enough, I threw my hands above the surface of the water and I screamed, "Get me the heck out of this water, now." Adam and someone else must have registered the sheer panic in my voice because I was suddenly being lifted up. I had my hand on the bottom lip of the deck when Adam's eyes went wide, and the crew member beside him shrieked, dropped my arm, and began to scramble backwards. Panicking, I snatched at Adam with both arms and held on, forcing him to use all his strength just to stop the two of us from pitching into the water. Just as I thought that we would lose the fight, I suddenly started to rise without effort. A current from below started to buoy me upwards, and I caught a glimpse of a mouth wider than a door lurching up towards me. I became so afraid that my whole body went numb, and for a few brief seconds, it felt as if I was watching the whole scene from outside my own body. I noted the detached horror that the shark's rubbery mouth had already reached my waist, but to Adam's credit, he kept a grip on me and took advantage of the shark's upward momentum to pull me the rest of the way before that grotesque yawning mouth could snap shut around me. I hit the deck in a state of pure shock and looked down expecting to see my legs to be torn to shreds. Did it bite me?" I stammered. "They have no teeth," Hannah explained. "They can't. It couldn't possibly have mistaken you for food. It must have been an accident. It's dead." Adam was leaning over the rails and shaking his head. I struggled to process what he had said, so I dragged myself up and flopped over to the edge where the monster lay on its side. In daylight, I could see that it was bloated, broken skin running along its flanks. Colorless fat fell out of open wounds like clumps of sofa stuffing, and the eye facing us was burst and empty. In one or two places, I could clearly make out bone. "What the heck?" I muttered. As if it was tired of being watched, the whale shark twitched and its body fell lifelessly below the water. The suction of its descent pulled the floating trash back over like a blanket, and within seconds, there was no sign that there had even been anything there. Why aren't there any gulls? Alec was the captain of the vessel and an otherwise taciturn man who rarely spoke to the documentary crew. It was plain as day that he particularly disliked the scientists who filled the lower decks with endless equipment and chatty cliques. But I guess that he must have found the filming crew a little easier to speak to, since he had asked me for a light once or twice and had now sought me out on deck to ask a question. "What do you mean?" "Every time we pass this way, the sky is filled with the things," he replied as he scanned the horizon. "It's a floating garbage dump," he added. "But now, where are the gulls? It's never like this, never quiet." I took a moment to listen to the gentle serration of whispering plastic caught in the tropical waves. "We must be due to leave soon?" I asked, and he nodded. "Thank God for that," I added. A few seconds of silence as he smoked his cigarette. "I took a look at the footage that you brought up," he said. "Still not sure what that shark was doing." "Hannah says the animal must have been confused," I replied. "Blind, didn't even know that I was in the water." "Right." I could tell by Alec's vacant gaze that he didn't think much of that. "Only thing is, I stayed up last night going over that footage. Not just the stuff that you shot deliberately, but the GoPro footage from the cameras that you had strapped to your back. And that thing had been following you since you got in the water." "What do you think that means?" "It means that it was hunting you," he replied. I thought back to the endless glimpses of a strange shape passing forever in the distance. "Hannah says that they're not predators." "They aren't," he confirmed. "Even if it got you, it couldn't have done anything with you. It's a filter feeder. It eats plankton. Best it could have done was drown you out of spite." I took a deep breath and I appreciated the feeling of being alive and dry on the ship. Alec looked ready to say something when we were both distracted by the sound of flapping wings as a gull descended onto the floating island. I chuckled and began to say, "Signs of life at," when a quiet splash interrupted and the gull was sucked below the surface. I didn't even have time to struggle. Alec and I remained silent, rooted to the spot until the ship's engine started, and the island began to recede slowly but surely into the distance. "How far did we travel?" I asked. 80 to 100 miles depending on the tides," Adam replied, looking at me like he hoped that I might have some kind of explanation. I didn't, and we both turned to Alec and Hannah as they emerged from the cabin and began to address the crowd on deck. Everybody had gathered that morning after some of the crew had rung the alarm. Since then, every check you could imagine had been run. Engines, GPS, radio. Some people suggested that we simply hadn't moved. Others were adamant that they knew the feel of the ship underway. But what explanation was there? The garbage patch had followed us. "It has to be the currents," Adam muttered quietly as Hannah cupped her hands around her mouth and called for attention. "Everyone," she cried. "As you know, we appear to not have moved. This has raised some understandable concerns, but I've spoken to the Coast Guard and after checking multiple sources, I can confirm that we really have traveled closer to shore. We're on our way home." There was an audible sense of relief that carried through the crowd. "Unfortunately," Alec added, "the tides have caused the patch to follow us, and as is clear, it has even overtaken us. We don't have an easy route in or out of the island. We can still stick to our current heading, but with so much debris, nets especially, I made the decision to travel at quarter speed. If something gets caught in the propeller, I want to limit the damage. We're looking at least a week before we get home, Hannah said, clarifying the captain's words. As one, the crowd began to cry out in anger and frustration. Thinking of taking a dip? Alec sidled up to me as I smoked a cigarette on the deck. It was quiet out, with most people having slunk away to their cabins so they could mope in private. But I found it uncomfortable down there. My cabin was below the waterline, and the sounds that I had been hearing had kept me up. Strange scratches, little taps. They were probably nothing, but that didn't stop the nightmares. I'd rather run a marathon with my butt cheeks sewn shut, I replied. Alec burst out laughing. I don't blame you, he said once the laughter had died down. I haven't seen anything like that in my life. Not just the footage, but the shark afterwards. Half its guts were ripped out. How could it even swim? It's like it was. Whatever point Alec was going to make was interrupted by the sound of something heavy and wet hitting the deck. When we turned, we saw a seagull, mutilated and bloody, feathers strewn around the point of impact. Together, we both looked up into the cloudless night sky. Where the heck did that come from? I snapped, and there hadn't been a sound. Not the cawing of gulls or the flapping of wings. We walked over to the bird and were struck by the god-awful smell and the harrowing sight of bone and glistening muscle. Pale yellow fluid oozed out of every open wound, and the bird's anatomy had been ruined by the impact to the point where I wasn't sure what was meant to be a wing or a head or a tail or a torso. I've seen roadkill in better shape, I said. I don't understand what happened to it, Alec replied as he leaned in, one hand clamped over his mouth and nose. It looks like it encountered something corrosive, a toxic chemical. The bird stood up. With what must have been a lot of effort, it tried to flap its way towards Alec, who cried out and stumbled backwards. Both of us swore, and I even burst into a nervous laughter, which I often do when I'm scared. How is it still alive? Alec had asked. I squinted at the bird as it continued the torturous journey towards us. It isn't, I said. I mean it clearly. That's its brainstem, I said while pointing towards what looked like a pale white centipede dangling loosely to one side. And where's the beak? The thing doesn't have a head. No brain, no life. The bird hopped another step closer. It has to be alive, Alec cried while pointing to the bustling pile of flesh and feathers. It's coming towards us, for Pete's sake. Both of us took a step to the right, and the bird turned to keep us in its path. Nope, I said with a quick shake of the head. Nope, not doing this. I stepped forward and kicked the bird as hard as I could, sending it whistling through the air like a shuttlecock before it plunked into the water. Alec and I stared at each other, and after a moment's tension began to laugh. It felt like the only sane reaction to such a nightmarish encounter, especially since no real danger had been involved. I assumed that there had to be a sensible explanation. Like Alec said, a toxic spill perhaps, or some exotic disease. But in the moment, it felt good to just laugh after so much time spent afraid. We were still laughing when the ship's engine cut out, and the lights failed. It was clear in the morning light that the garbage around the ship was getting thicker. I stared at it through the windows and tried to suppress the strange notion that it didn't want to let us go. The engine room's a complete mess, Alec hissed as he stepped into the bridge where Hannah, Adam, and I waited. I've got some good guys on it, but the propeller didn't just stop. It was like something yanked the dang thing halfway off the ship. Ruined everything down there. Best that we can do is patch up the leaks. Any chance of repairing it and getting it going again? Hannah asked. Not in the water, he replied. I've asked the Coast Guard to send for a tow. How long will that take? I asked. A day at the most. 3 days later, and people were getting anxious. The radio calls between Alec and the Coast Guard were getting terse. I had passed the bridge late one night and heard Alec crying into the headset. "What do you mean you can't see us? We're right here, we're in the water. We've sent up flares, giving you coordinates. Read the stars, everything. We've done everything that you've asked. This isn't some life raft in the middle of nowhere. It's a ship with 30 people on it. It's bigger than most houses, for crying out loud. A day's journey and we'd be able to see the coast. How can you not find us?" In the end, it was Hannah's idea to try the dinghy and head for shore that way. It couldn't hold more than 2 people, but it would let someone get helped and lead the Coast Guard back. "Will this thing be able to push through all the garbage?" I asked as Hannah climbed the ladder and stepped onto the rubber floor below. "That's not far to shore," she replied, "and we have poles to help us maneuver around the worst of it. And you got plenty of food," she chuckled. "Frank, we won't be gone long enough to need food." "None of this is normal," I said while looking out at the rolling hills of rubbish. "You should be prepared for the worst." "You know, some of this stuff is thick enough to walk on," she replied. "And maybe we'll be able to hike part of the way." She said it as a joke to keep me from harping on about how bad an idea this all was, but it only made me feel worse. "Just don't get in the water," I replied. I don't know, just don't." "I won't." She smiled just as her companion turned up and began to climb down. I didn't know the woman well, but from what I understood, she was basically Hannah's makeup woman and closest friend. Jen, I think her name was. She saw the look on my face and reached over and squeezed Hannah's hand. "Don't worry," Jen told me. "I'll take good care of her." But the look on her face spoke volumes about the fear that she was trying to hide. "Everything ready?" Alec asked as he appeared beside me. "We only have one more of these," he told Hannah as he pointed to the dinghy. "So please look after it. And please come back." One by one, the others came by and waved goodbye to the pair of women who all our hopes were resting on. Once the final farewells were said, Alec helped launch the dinghy with a barge pole as Hannah started the onboard motor and Jen began to pedal. Slowly, the distance between us and them grew, and the little canal they had carved in the garbage patch was filled by the currents. They were about 100 yards away from us when they both turned, smiled, and waved, and we all returned the gesture. And then the dinghy was pulled below. Screams, cries, a loud splash, and before any of us could even begin to react, the garbage had floated back and to cover the space where they had once floated. "You can't seriously be thinking of this," I cried as Adam jumped into the spare dinghy and prepped the motor. "It's not far," he said, climbing back aboard to grab spare jackets and a lifesaver. "We need to check." "There's something in the water," I told him. "It's just gonna do the same thing to you that it did to them." "We don't know that," he replied. "Adam," Alex said, and something in the captain's voice stopped both of our bickering. "This isn't a good situation to be stuck in, and I don't think this kind of impulsive response is wise. Maybe there is something in the water." "What?" he stuttered. "Because of the shark. You were wrong, it wasn't hunting us. That's like saying you're being stalked by a freaking cow. It's a filter feeder, and Hannah's dinghy must have been broken or punctured maybe, or it hit something below the water. A rock, I don't know. But they need help, and I can't seriously believe the two of you are suggesting that we just sit there and let our friends drown." "Adam," I began to say. "No, if you won't come with me, that's fine, but my decision is made." He turned and threw the lifesaver into the dinghy where it landed with a loud thud. Not a second after it had stopped moving. The entire little boat was torn down into the water with such astonishing force that it sent a spray of water 10 and 20 feet high. Once the water had settled, all 3 of us were left staring into the open space in the trash that had been left by the dinghy, and I caught a glimpse of something pale and reddish sweeping past. A long and thin limb covered in fleshy barbs. An eye, just as swift, also flashed by. The sense of looking at an alien life form was unmistakable. Its skin, a rugose pattern of wrinkled flesh. a single black orb of an eye glaring back at us from a torpedo-shaped head, and opposite it, an empty socket where another eye should be. Slowly, the trash bobbed back into place and our view of what lay below is hidden. "Was that a frickin' squid?" Adam stuttered, his skin paper white. Both Adam and Alec had spent the best part of 8 hours on the radio with the Coast Guard, but we had no luck. The best estimate anyone had was that we were trapped in the garbage patch and it was being carried away by the currents, so that our position and heading were almost impossible to discern. You would think the GPS would solve that problem, but for the life of us, no set of coordinates we gave ever seemed to help. The Coast Guard were often adamant that they were flying overhead, but whenever we looked there was nothing to see or hear. People were starting to get hungry. We had a decent supply of food, but we would have to start rationing. Slowly, layer by layer, it felt as if the journey was descending into a life or death struggle. And yet I found it hard to take seriously. The ship was huge and luxurious. Many crew whittled the day away in the gym or watching satellite TV. But time was limited and we all knew that. Still, I stood on deck and watched the garbage, unable to shake the feeling that something was just out of sight and watching me back. From behind, I heard someone approach. I figured that it was Alec come out once again to steal a cigarette. I kept my eyes on the water and I called out, "I wouldn't bother, I'm out." There was no reply. My smile faded and the hair on my neck raised as I registered a wet, fetid stench and heavy labored breathing completely unlike Alec's, or anyone's really. This was the wet gurgle of someone whose lungs were filled with fluid, and I turned, not sure what to expect, but already terrified beyond measure. It was Hannah. "Don't." Alec reached out with his arm to stop Adam from touching her. The gesture worked. Adam withdrew his hand, and it wasn't hard to see why. Hannah was missing the back of her skull along with the bottom half of her jaw, but she stood on deck, clothes torn and dripping, her skin a pallid greenish blue, a standing corpse, a walking nightmare. Her eyes were cloudy, but they often fixed the nearest person to talk, which I found to be the most frightening thing of all. She was in there somewhere, or at least something was. She looked like she had been taken apart and put back together again, and somehow she still moved, heard, saw. Her nervous system was still firing away, sending signals to a body that should not have been able to respond. Minutes passed and Adam swallowed his fear. He took off his jacket, ignored Alex's weak plea to be careful, and stepped close enough to drape it over Hannah's shoulders. "Hannah, are you okay? Where's Jen?" Those cloudy eyes turned to him, but her head and body didn't move. "I don't think we can expect much of an answer," I said. "Hannah?" Adam asked, but she only stared, and I became slowly convinced that there was nothing of Hannah left inside that body. Those eyes watched us, sure, but I don't think the images were being relayed back to a woman that we once knew. Instead, I felt another intelligence behind them, something malignant, curious, and dangerous, I don't know. For now, it felt content to watch us, and that more than anything, it worried me. "She won't move," Adam said as he tried to turn her shoulders away and lead her indoors. She merely shrugged his hands off and continued to flick her gaze from each of us to the other. I pointed to the blood on the deck. It was already coagulated, the texture of rice pudding. "No doctor's going to fix that," I said. "Just leave her there. Maybe tie her to the gunwale first with a length of rope. I don't think we need her roaming around the place." Hannah was gone in the morning. The rope that we had tied her to was overboard, and when we pulled it up, we found it soaked in a foul-smelling liquid. Even worse, despite briefing everyone and making it clear to stay away, we were down a person on the head count. I wasn't sure how, but I figured the two events were related, and the thought made me shudder. God help the poor soul that she had taken down there with her. By now, the atmosphere had taken a dark turn. One by one, everybody had come along, usually in groups of 2 or 3 and in bright daylight, to gawk at Hannah during the time that she had been aboard. The effect was haunting, not just the sight of a walking corpse, no. It was the intelligence behind her eyes that was really unsettling. I got the distinct sense that she was watching us, counting our number and gathering a sense of who and what we were. I don't think that I was the only one to feel that way. After discovering someone was missing the next day, everybody pretty much locked themselves in their cabins and stayed out of sight, and I couldn't blame them. Only Adam, Alec, and I stuck around on deck, and even that was only to try and find a way out of this mess. Not that the others were idle. At least one group of crew had banded together and were trying to make a raft out of a spare material in the hold below. Another were working on their computers to try and get the Coast Guard to us. Meanwhile, the actual sailing crew had fallen in line under one of the engineers and were working furiously to get the engine back online. My plan was a little simpler. "This isn't safe," Adam said as I threw another lump of wood onto the pile of timber that floated below. "Nope," I replied, "it isn't." But that didn't stop him handing me another piece that we had torn from the ship's interior. Alex soon appeared, hauling another table from the canteen. "I'll break this up," he said. "Adam, you get the fuel." "It wasn't easy," he replied. "The guys down below didn't want to let it go. They were convinced that they'll have us up and running in no time." "We don't need all of our supply to get to shore," Alex said. "If they succeed, great. But I would like to give this plan a go anyway." "The Coast Guard know what to look for?" I asked, and he nodded. "A big plume of smoke." "Does it look big enough?" I asked after we had finished throwing the table one leg at a time onto the pile below. "If the plastic catches, then we should be good, right?" Adam said. "And it doesn't have to be big, just smoky." Alex surveyed the wood and shrugged. I had managed to hook a bundle of floating tires and nets, and I was using that as the base of the bonfire. "There's a serious risk that we could set this whole patch alight," Adam said, "us included. More the smoke could suffocate us all, like being trapped in a wildfire," I added, and both Adam and Alec looked at me with frustration. "It was your plan," Adam grumbled. "I'm just pointing out that this isn't a safe plan. It's just a plan, and I don't think that we're at a huge risk. The wood will burn, but everything below, it might char and bubble. Might go up a little, but it's also soaked in water. I don't think this whole thing is going to go up in flame. I mean, it's been here for years. If it could burn, wouldn't somebody have just done that already? Just torch the whole patch, if not to get rid of it, then just for fun." Alex sighed. "He's right," he replied. "I don't think we need..." "What?" I stopped what I was doing, pouring gasoline haphazardly over the side of the ship, and I turned to look in the direction of Alec and Adam's gaze. They were staring at the strangest thing that I had ever seen. It looked like a blimp almost, but floating in the water, a large round object with a ribbed, striated surface. Its skin was pale blue, but the space between each was blood red. It made me think of some jellyfish maybe, like a man of war. Only this thing was the size of a small house. "It's definitely coming towards us, right?" Adam asked, and Alec nodded. I think I sensed the danger early on. In fact, the others probably did too. But we were baffled by this strange shape. It looked like nothing that I had ever seen before, and as it came closer, it carried with it the most god-awful sound that you could ever imagine. It was like metal struggling to hold up some impossible weight. A long, drawn-out keening wail that was so loud, it drew everyone out of the hold and onto the deck where all of us, a crowd of 30, stared in disbelief. By the time that it was close enough to bump against the ship's hull, the sound that it emitted was deafening. Alec asked me a question, but I couldn't hear him, so he nudged my arm and pointed at the water below. There I saw that the floating object took on a slightly more recognizable shape. A wrinkled eye blinked, A fin gently stroked through the water. It was a whale, and I suddenly remembered tales of how their floating carcasses could inflate to impossible size and pose serious risks to passing ships. All that pressure and rancid meat, a pressure cooker of disease that could send lumps of meat as big as a man hurling for hundreds of meters. I ran and hit the floor just as it went off. I lifted my head to pure carnage. A crowd of 30 people were screaming, everyone soaked top to bottom in blood and rotten fat. White irises glared back at me from faces painted crimson, and dozens were on their knees coughing and retching. But it wasn't just disgust. Something else was going on. Adam crawled towards me, screaming in pain. "Get it off!" He shrieked as he tried to pull his top off. "Get it the heck off me!" I rushed over and helped him pull the t-shirt off, only to reveal something crawling over his skin. It too was soaked in blood and hard to see, with frighteningly long legs with a small disc-shaped body. It skittered out of sight at lightning speed, but it wasn't alone. Dozens of them covered Adam's skin, and they were biting and latching onto his flesh, wrapping legs around his torso like harvestmen against tree bark. I dug my fingers under one set of spidery legs and tore them away, but it wasn't enough. I saw at least 3 of them burrow into his flesh and disappear. I looked around and slowly appreciated the scale of what had just happened. The deck was covered in hundreds of these monstrous sea spiders, and they were making short work of everybody left alive after the explosion. Already there were at least 10 people convulsing on the floor as these plate-sized arachnids tore through their insides. This wasn't my proudest moment, but even as Adam screamed and begged for help, I knew there was nothing that I could do except run. So I turned, ready to flee, and saw Alec stood before me, soaked in it too. He held a can of gasoline over his head, its contents already dripping through his hair and trickling across the deck. "It's inside me," he whimpered as his thumb rubbed the flint of a lighter over and over, trying desperately to get it to ignite. I looked down and saw gasoline spreading amongst my feet. "Alec," I said. "Alec, what?" The lighter caught. For a flash, there was only a tiny flame hovering over his thumb, and then it finally found the fuel and it was all let loose. The fire was virulent. People, already soaked in blubber, became living candles that thrashed and ran across the ship, fleeing deeper into the decks below and spreading the flames faster than I thought possible. I was forced to flee to the stern of the ship where the air was clearer. Once there, I gripped the railing and I turned to face the fire. People still screamed, but as these seconds ticked on, the agonized cries of those still alive began to thin out, as one by one they died out of my sight. My heart sank. It was clear that there was no saving the ship. We had life rafts, but they were at the bow and already lost. The last thing that I wanted to do was jump into the water, but it was starting to look like it was either that or burn alive. I was genuinely contemplating which of the 2 deaths that I would rather have, when I heard a noise that I had spent days hoping to hear. For a moment I thought that it might be a cruel trick of the mind, but it grew with each passing second until I was finally sure of what it was. A helicopter. It circled the ship at some distance, unable to come closer because of the smoke. I could already feel the heat at my back as the fire caught up with me, and I looked down below convinced that swimming was not an option. But what if no one saw me, I thought. The smoke was growing thicker with every second. What if they left thinking they couldn't help anyone? Nana had joked about that in places. The island was thick enough to support a person's weight. I looked at the floating garbage below and decided that I had to at least try, especially with help so close by. I also needed a way to get noticed, and thankfully a first aid box in the nearby wall contained a flare that I grabbed and stuffed into my pocket. I climbed the rail and awkwardly lowered myself down as far as I could, until I finally let go and dropped the rest of the way. My feet hit something solid enough to stop myself instantly from being submerged, but it quickly began to sink into the water. Before I got further than my knees, I jumped onto another clump of floating plastic, and that too began to sink, I quickly realized that if I stayed in one place for even a second, my weight would overcome the island's buoyancy. I couldn't risk the water, not with what I knew. And so I ran. I picked footholds at random and sometimes not very well. At one point, my heel struck the edge of some bundled up net filled with buckets, only for the whole thing to rotate and nearly pitch me into the water. But I had enough forward momentum to be sent hurtling onto what might have been once the fiberglass prow of an old speedboat. I don't know how far I got before I struck the flare and began to scream. I couldn't turn or stop, not even for an instant. If I did, I would sink and drown, or maybe worse. All I could do was keep going 1 foot at a time, and just pray that the helicopter saw me as I held a glowing fireball over my head at arm's length. Eventually, my luck had run out though. The floating island was a piecemeal jumble of old trolley nets and dumped plastic, and I stepped onto what looked like a fairly buoyant clump of bottles and nylon rope, expecting it to hold me up only for it to give in instantly. I hit the water face first, and the flare went out. I tried to kick, to free my leg and keep going, but it was useless. All hope drained. I hadn't had time to hold my breath and already my lungs were burning. Unable to help myself, I looked down. I saw shapes floating in the water, vertical at rest. People, whales, sharks, squid, turtles. Lifeless things that lay in wait, part of something larger, I'm sure. Below them, a single shadow too dark to simply be the abyss. Overhead, the water churned, the trash parted, and a ray of light flashed past me. It was weak, but it landed on whatever was below. It was big, too big to make sense of, too big to give a shape. In the end, I think that I saw only a part of it. An eye, nothing more. It saw me, I know, because one of the floating animals, a squid, broke out of its trance and began to glide towards me. It too was a broken, mutilated thing kept alive. An undead monstrosity enslaved by whatever lay below. I suddenly began to regret not burning to death. The squid was 100 yards out when something plopped into the water below me. I looked up into the blinding sun and saw a ladder within arm's reach. I grabbed it, and with a mind that no longer felt whole, I quickly climbed out of the water. I wouldn't bother, the man said as he sat down beside me on the park bench. I snatched my phone into my pocket, irritated that someone had clearly been reading over my shoulder. They won't publish anything in the news. They didn't when I tried. Email them all you want, it doesn't matter. The only luck that I had was online, and I think that's because most people assumed my story was fiction. Thanks for the advice, I grumbled. And whether I believed him or not, I found myself hastily deleting the email that I was writing. It had been a month since my rescue, and I had already sent dozens to the big news sites. No one responded, and there was no reason to believe the 12th email would magically work. Anyway, he said, I'm Steven. I'm a scientist who used to specialize in robotics. What do you specialize in now? I asked. I think, he said, firmly planting the emphasis on the last word. I specialize in whatever it was you saw down in the water. I hope I'm wrong, of course, because what I specialize in, what I saw, the last time I saw it, it was trapped. But if you saw it too out in the open water, well, I don't even want to think about what that means.